So here is the histogram. Now, a cool thing about this histogram style is available in a lot of like modern DSLRs or mirrorless cameras. So if you have a Canon RP, or if you have, one of these modern day Nikon cameras or whatever, you get these live histograms. And this is telling us a fair bit about what is going on in the shot. Now, this actual frame, this actual picture, is telling us not from left to right what's happening in the picture, but it's combining all of the data and showing it in a graph. Okay, so when you're looking at the histogram, you're looking at all of the data combined, all the highs and lows, all of the blacks, all of the whites, all the mids, everything, all in one combined pool of data, and then it's being shown all that data on one graph. All right, and that is a big difference. We'll talk about the other types of scopes that we have available, but for this one, you have to know when I move my arms in the frame, you notice that the histogram changes, but it doesn't change like on the left and right side of the histogram. On other styles of scopes, like a waveform, for example, when you do that, you can actually basically see the information in that portion of the frame change. So that's not what's happening here, okay? Histograms is combining all of the data, all of the highs, all of the lows, all of the mids, and is displaying it in one graph. All right, so all that data is together. Now, how do you read this? A histogram shows you from basically from one side to the other. The left side of this screen is showing. Actually, that's interesting. Okay, so the program, I am actually showing this out. Okay, the left. I just want to be sure you guys can see all this. The left side of the screen is talking about the actual black levels of this camera. Okay, the black levels of this camera are on the very left side of this screen of the little histogram. The white levels are on the very right side of the screen. Okay, so now working left to right. So blacks, then we have shadows, then we have midtones, which are like, it's almost like, it's, how do I break this up? Let's say 2/5 in the middle and 2/5 on the other side, okay, is your midtones. And that's where that big spike is, kind of on that, on the right of center. You see that big spike in the middle of the histogram. Okay, these are midtones in the shot, and that's going to be a lot of like skin and my reflection, because I don't have any makeup on, so I don't have a way of deadening that harshness that's bouncing off of my skin. So the midtones are really bright, really really high, and then we have your highlights, which would be kind of, let's say 4/5 of the graph, so moving to the right. And then last but not least, you're going to have your whites. And so this is things that are absolute pure white in the shot. Okay, it's going to be on the far right portion. So here we can kind of see where the majority of our data is. As I move my hands around, okay, this is actually known as a live histogram. And histograms are used in photography a lot to kind of be sure that you're not losing data on the low end, but you're also not losing data on the high end. So you're not losing data into the blacks and the abyss that is the black tone, but also getting blown out on the whites, and things are just pure white, that there's no data inside there at all. So as if you were to overexpose this shot, you would see this happening. Now, you know what? I can maybe even do one better, and maybe we can overexpose this shot. So let's see what happens when I go over to exposure and I start to open up the shutter speed. So I'm at 1/60 right now. Okay. Now I'm going to go to 1/20. All right. So the frame drop is brutal. It's hard to watch this, but check out what happened to the histogram. Notice that the pure blacks in this shot are now not in the black zone. They're in the shadow zone, right? Notice that the midtones have now been pushed into the highlights region. That spike in the midtones is pushed into the highlights region, and now we actually are seeing pure white data, which is probably this right here, pure white data being exposed on that histogram. So we can kind of see, like, this shot is clearly overexposed. The data is stretched way too far. across this, and I don't want it to look like this. I actually want my blacks to be deeper than what this is permitting, and it's really blowing out the shot. It's way overexposed. So let's change this now to 1/30, okay? Okay, so we've increased by 10 frames, and that makes a big difference to start, right? But you have noticed that my highlights are flirting with the high end of the mids, right? So we've got our highlights it's basically right on that line of where mids and highlights start to cross. And that is where the majority of the bright portion of this shot is dwelling. But you also notice that I'm not losing data in the blacks range still. Notice how the blacks kind of come right off the end, and then there's a space there. Those are your true blacks. And if you move all of that data on this histogram down, you start underexposing the shot, that black range is going to get filled with that data that's in that spot. So this, potentially, is actually fairly close to being exposed, relatively close. It's a little bright, but relatively close. So if I now double the frames, I go 1/60, which is what we had before. Now notice, now the blacks are now squished up against the side, right? And obviously, from coming back from what we were just looking at, it looks underexposed. However, I want to lose some of the black data. That's kind of one of my trademarks of the coloration that I do on this show. And so I want the blacks to be right up against the edge there and to basically be losing the actual black data that's in the shadows and, is true black. That also happens with the side of this monitor, okay? So we got a monitor here that has basically just pure black. Well, that is in that portion of the histogram. So this is how we can read some of this. Now, my midtones are actually a little lower than they were originally. And so what we can do with that is we can go down to like 1/50. And this is really more, I think, where I'm going to leave it. So I'm running 1/50. I'm actually only shooting in 30 frames, and so that's no big deal. But if you do 1/50 or 1/30, see, 30 seems a little too bright. 1/50 seems to be pretty good. If I were to go to 30, though, and then I were to adjust the iris, which gives me a little bit more granular control over the actual lens itself, I could dial this back in pretty much perfectly how I want this. This is what I want. So my midtones are not flirting with the highlights section and certainly nowhere near the white section, but it's right in that nice little sweet spot where that's where my midtones need to be. I'm shooting at 1/30 at f-stop 4.8, and I don't know what my lumens reading is, but hey, there's a toy that I don't own. So histogram is super helpful, but what I would strongly recommend is that you do this with a neutral background. Because if you were to introduce color, things start changing oddly. Now, we get a general gist of things, okay? We get a general idea as to where things are, but as intensities change and as colors change, the live histogram starts moving all over the place. And so you really don't want this going on when you're trying to do this. And so the key here is to set it all up with a neutral background and then add your coloration afterwards and see what it does to your shot. Now, there's some give and take here. There's a little bit of playing that you have to do with understanding your shot. You notice, like, I'm getting a lot of blue reflections on the sides of my face. That's a part of the colors that I've chosen to use in this shot. But that's just kind of a ramification. What you don't see is an entire studio of white drop ceiling that is also lit up basically with ambient light. And so it's bouncing off all over the place. I should take black fabric and cover it all to really control the light a bit, but ain't nobody got time for that. So we will control the group. I'm going to go back to my lighting situation. And this is just a white light. It's running at like 5400 Kelvin for those of you keeping score, but it's a white light. It's kind of like sunlight. It's kind of in between. It's a good studio light, but that's what these lights are all set at, 54. This one's 54. This one's 50. The ones on the floor are now 54. That gives me a nice even wash, and it makes the colors true. This is the color of this wall. It's gray, and it's really helpful when you're trying to do scopes. So, okay, that is the histogram, and it's super helpful if you understand the basic use of the histogram. Okay. The next one we're going to talk about is waveform. And the reason why we're going to talk about waveform is because it bleeds into another one later on. So let me make sure. Oh, and let me make sure I said everything I wanted to say about histogram. Oh, yes. So the only other thing about histogram is that you want to be sure. Let's go back to this real quick because I need to spend another second here on this. When in the photography realm, histograms typically, like beginner courses are going to say something along the lines of you want on your histogram you want to have like a bell curve, okay, like a nice mountain in the middle. Again, yes, that's a good place to start. However, depending on what you want your picture to look like, what you want the shot to look like, that will change. Okay? If you want your blacks to be a little darker, if you want to lose the data in the actual shadows, it's not going to be a nice little mountain. It's going to look different, okay? But the key is that when you set this up and you get comfortable with the way that the shot looks and you get comfortable with the scopes, now you can do this on multiple cameras across the fleet, and it doesn't matter as much. Okay, it still matters, but it doesn't matter as much the coloration of your monitors that you're using. So one of the huge advantages of scopes in general is once you figure how to use these, once you figure this out and you understand the basic data that's being shown, the color balance of your monitors doesn't matter as much because you could pretty much look at your histogram and the other scopes and the options and get this stuff leveled without too much variation. Okay, so if you don't have the budget for a nice production monitor that has true colors and it's all balanced and you can pay through the nose for those things. If all you have is your $100 TV or your computer monitor, the histogram and the other scopes that we're going to talk about can greatly help you with this. And so, there you go. There's a little bonus for spending some time getting used to and learning more about these options.